Thank you for giving me a few minutes to provide some input to the stakeholder dialogue where hopefully you will eventually succeed in creating an Indian Green University network. I speak to you from the Netherlands and I have to limit myself to a video message and I would like to thank Gayatri Rakwa for giving me this opportunity and for organizing this important event. I've titled my short talk, A Networked and Nested Whole Institution Approach to Sustainability. And those words networked and nested are intentionally chosen, of course, because I think what is critical if higher education is going to contribute to a more sustainable world, that the education and research and community outreach is always connected and nested in a wider global world without losing the local connections with place and the existential issues that affect our students, but obviously also the people living in our communities. In a way, the local environment is a microcosm of the wider world. And the network part, as I will say at the end of my talk, is critical if we are to connect the niches of change and transformation that can be found, I think, all over the world, also in Indian educational context. If we can connect these niches, they can become a strong movement, a strong transition movement. Kate Raworth, you see the donut in front of you, the donut economy that she has been advocating for, puts it quite clearly. I think we need to learn to live within ecological boundaries while at the same time maintaining a quality social foundation which allows meaningful, happy lives for everybody on this earth without compromising the possibilities for others to have the same. This also means attentiveness and care and sensitivity towards other species on this planet. And the Sustainable Development Goals, in a way, can be seen in this donut. And some are more on the inside, connected to the social aspect of sustainability, you might say, and some are more on the ecological side, on the outskirts. But one needs the other, and we cannot address the Sustainable Development Goals in a piecemeal, separate approach. We need to see their interconnections. And, so a transition is needed, and we see that all over the world people are talking about transitions in food towards more localized systems, for more varied and diverse systems, less dependent on fossil fuels and pesticides. We're looking at energy transitions away from fossil fuels. We're also looking at more self-determined, decentralized forms of governance. We're looking at greening of cities and making sure that the air quality gets better, that the exhaust becomes less, but also looking at dealing with extreme weather events. How do we deal with water that comes very rapidly and quickly all of a sudden, and the next period might be one of drought or extreme heat. This extreme weather requires climate smart building and adaptive cities and things like that. So there's a lot happening, and the question is, are our universities responsive to these changes? Are we relevant to today's global challenges that are emerging? But also, are we reimaginative in helping young people imagine a more hopeful future? Because without that, I think we risk that education becomes doom and gloom education if we do not provide more hopeful futures where young people can imagine and create and design alternative ways of living that allow us to live in the donut. There is a whole movement around us. I think we recognize this. There are lots of initiatives from NGOs, civil society organizations, sometimes from local governments, sometimes from schools, primary, secondary, even school kindergartens take initiatives of greening school grounds, having green rooftops, things like that. But there's also in higher education lots of initiatives. using living labs, for instance, trying to engage different stakeholders in working towards sustainability. Here are just some examples of these transition movements, and I think a big question is, how does higher education connect with these movements? How can students and staff participate, contribute, and vice versa? How can these movements benefit from the wisdom, the collective wisdom that is in our higher education institutions? There's a lot of knowledge out there that can be very helpful. And this is not just scientific knowledge. I think we also recognize the power of local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, experiential knowledge, how to weave these different forms of knowledge together. That is, I think, critical for a more sustainable future. Here, the urban living labs, but there are also rural living labs nowadays, where different stakeholders co-create a more sustainable world in which students and staff participate. It's a very powerful living curriculum that is relevant to existential questions that really matter. And a lot of young people today, they're really thinking not so much about their careers, but about a more hopeful future and a more meaningful life. And also people living in under conditions of poverty, they have, of course, a stake in all this as well, and also a lot of knowledge and understanding of how to live more lightly on the earth, maybe not by choice, but by force. Still, this is a powerful source of higher education, and also these young people deserve to benefit from this type of education. The whole school approach or the whole institution approach takes on this more holistic view of education and learning. And you can hear, this is from the UNESCO Global Education Monitor report, it's an imagery of how universities and schools can become this living laboratory for learning to live sustainably on the earth, with different forms of learning, different forms of pedagogy and teaching, different connections with community than before, where there gets more reciprocal synergies between school, university, and community, and the world of work, the world of education, the world of research, but also the world of governance and of civil society, working together in a social learning process. This whole institution approach has different components. I don't have time to get into them, but it has also to do with whether our institutions kind of live sustainably and try to experiment with lowering the carbon footprint, the ecological footprint, and expanding the ecological handprint, being consistent in what we espouse, what we say is important, but also in what we actually do, and making that a topic of investigation in the curriculum and in research. Also, the professional development of teachers is critical if we want to live or learn more integratively, more holistically, and do more systems thinking and boundary crossing and work more with local communities, then our teachers must know how to do that. This requires different forms of capacity building of teachers. School community and university community connections, how to broker relationships between local businesses and the university, or civil society organizations and the university, or with interest groups, advocacy groups. How can we work with them, learn from them, and how can we also deal with conflicts and diversity, different positions regarding what to do? These are all sources of meaningful learning. And then, of course, the curriculum needs to be more nested in local issues, in the live world of the students, in the local community. Then it becomes more relevant, and we have sustainability challenges all around us, but we hardly tap into them in our schools and universities. And finally, there are all kinds of forms of pedagogy and learning, whether this is citizen science, inquiry-based learning, or social learning, or transformative learning, or even transgressive learning, where people learn to go how to go against the grain and to disrupt systems that are so resilient but so unsustainable that they need to be changed. And how can we do that? That requires transgressive learning. So these new pedagogies and forms of learning need to become more part of our education system. And of course, in the middle, at the heart, you will find that there needs to be some vision, that people co-create, different stakeholders in the university, including the students, of course, need to be a part of that conversation. And that needs to be recalibrated and revisited every now and then. sustainability is a continuous quest. It's not a destination that we will reach one day, but it is something we must be looking for when we can. So just to wrap up, I've gone over my time already. Just as a conversation starter for the discussion afterwards, and maybe also connecting with the session after this one. First, I think it's critical that all the stakeholders in the higher education system become part of the conversation, basically about what is education for. What kind of agenda are we serving as an educational community? Are we strengthening sustainability in society, or are we maybe unwillingly weakening it? And how do we bring in especially the voices of young people who live longer on this planet than most of us, and they have much to gain by a change and a transition. Their voices need to be heard as they become more anxious and uncertain about the future. Secondly, how can the local environment with all its challenges become a rich source for sustainability? There are so many issues around us, possibilities for learning, questioning, critiquing, investigating, exploring, evaluating, assessing, monitoring, and so on, but we hardly tap into them. Our curriculum remains one driven by disciplinary questions and by textbooks even still, or maybe a TEDx talk, but why don't we just go out and immerse ourselves in the local community and also explore these issues with the wider globe in mind. They're all nested in the wider world. And what happens here today is connected to the world elsewhere, obviously. Thirdly, boundary crossing between disciplines, between the university and the community, but also between different sectors in society, between different generations, becomes more and more important to have a more holistic understanding of what is happening to the world, and to find solutions to these very wicked problems that we are facing. So how can we make that the new normal? Fourthly, we live in a system that is very much influenced by a culture of accountability, management, control thinking, efficiency thinking, ranking. And this is in a way stifling, minimizing the possibility for this more experiential form of learning, this more existential form of learning. And we need to open that up. We need to create a culture of reflexivity, a culture of investigation, a culture of sharing, a culture of solidarity and co-creation. And how can we move away from that culture of accountability towards a culture of reflexivity? Also, and maybe lastly, how can these niches that are all around us, where we see signs of resistance, of transition, of people wanting to live more lightly and more equitably and more fairly on the planet, and integrating that, connecting with living labs, change labs, challenge labs in higher education, how can we connect them so that they become a force, a movement? And this is, I think, where the Indian University Network, the Green University Network in India, can play a major role in moving from the niches to the mainstream and beginning to affect deep change in society. I wish you much luck with this and hopefully establishing a very powerful network that people from all around the world will be looking at for inspiration and guidance. Thank you very much.